Well, I think we'll get started. Welcome everyone to the third webinar in our hemp webinar series. Appreciate everybody turning out for the webinar today. It's a good thing to do on a really hot, steamy day. And today we're going to be talking about arthropod pests in hemp. And our speaker today is Scott Lewins. He's with UVM Extension. And before we get started and I turn this over to Scott, I just want to thank our sponsors for this webinar, the Northeastern IPM Center and NESARE, and the USDA Northeast Extension Risk Management and Education Program. We appreciate all their support. And the pests are definitely out there at large with this hot, dry weather. And so Scott is going to talk to us a bit about pests you might be seeing in hemp now and in the future, and how to manage those. So I'll let you take it from here, Scott.
Cool. Thank you, Heather. All right, I'm going to go ahead and kick Catherine off and share my screen. Let's see if this works. All right, Catherine, do you see my cover slide?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So as Heather mentioned, I am an entomology extension educator with UVM Extension. I've been working with the Northwest Crops and Soils team for many years, looking at sustainable pest management in a wide variety of crops, vegetable crops and hops, and now hemp. So let's see if I can advance. Perfect. So when we got started doing hemp trials in 2016, there was virtually no information about pests in hemp, particularly in the Northeast. Heather at that point had asked me to get to know what's out there in hemp fields. And then after the passage of the 2018 Farm Bill, things have really opened up, as you all know. And we're really starting to get a better idea for what types of arthropod pests we are accustomed to seeing here in Vermont. And I'm going to share a little bit of what we've found over the last few years. So some of those good guys, as well as the bad guys. Then what I'd like to do is just go through a little bit of the sort of very basic information about IPM, integrated pest management in hemp, and some of the things that you could do to manage pests in hemp. It looks like my slide advancing is not working the way I want it to. So the first pest, and probably the most common, at least in hemp outdoors in Vermont, are aphids, particularly the cannabis aphid, but there are other aphids. Actually, the hop aphid is also found in cannabis. So those aphids are kind of pear-shaped. All aphids are kind of a pear-shaped. The cannabis and the hop aphid that we're likely to see in hops are kind of a lime green color. And so I think you can see my cursor here. So that's a cannabis aphid found on the leaf, usually found on the underside of a hemp leaf. In fact, most pests you're going to find on the underside. And the cannabis aphid, you can't quite tell from this picture, but cannabis aphid is distinguished from other aphids because it's got these two little horns, kind of little devils, right? And most aphids, certainly the aphids that you're going to see on hemp, don't have those horns. Now, the exact species is really not that important from a management standpoint, but as an entomology geek, I like to kind of point out some of the different things. There are both winged and wingless forms of aphids. The winged forms, those with wings, are actually the sexually reproducing form. Most aphids reproduce asexually, so they actually pop out clones of themselves. So this is kind of crazy, and get ready, I'm going to blow your mind, but aphids are born pregnant. So as soon as they are born, they actually have clones of themselves ready to go. And so as a result, their populations can really skyrocket when the conditions are right. As the um, as they're sucking the life out of your hemp plant, they're feeding on the phloem, so the sap in the plant. And so the damage is generally not that bad, but as populations grow, they really can slow the growth, and in some cases, really high levels of infestation. They can reduce plant vigor, but also causing a little bit of yellowing. And then they produce a sugary substance called honeydew out of the back. There are these organs in the back, and little drops of honeydew can create what looks like a varnish on your leaf from the sugar, and that can actually promote the growth of sooty mold under the right conditions. Two-spotted spider mites are also really common on a wide variety of crops, as well as hemp. So also on the underside of the leaf, even smaller than an aphid, you'll find the two-spotted spider mites. Then they get their name because of the fact that the adults have these little black spots, so 2 spots. There are other spider mites. In fact, there are other mites. I'm going to mention one in a moment that impact hemp, but two-spotted spider mites are by far the most common. The adults, as I mentioned, have the little specks on the 2 spots on them, but the nymphs don't. So the nymphs will just have that straw color without the 2 spots that you see. You'll notice what's called stippling from sort of minor damage. So this leaf over here has sort of this stippling appearance. It's not a nice green, vibrant color. It's kind of got that brown spotting, right? That's indicative of a relatively low level infestation. But then as the infestation grows, you see more and more of the webbing, and that's where they get the name spider mite from, because they produce silk just like spiders do. And that silk helps protect them from natural enemies, and also helps protect them from pesticide applications. And so when you're seeing that webbing, there's generally a pretty high population that's hanging out at that point. Oops. The hemp russet mite, I'll mention really quickly. The most important thing is that it's not yet known in Vermont, so we'll start with the good news. The bad news is these guys are pretty nasty, and there's a lot of concern for when they do show up in Vermont. It's probably likely that they will show up eventually. It's challenging because you don't know that you have them until it's too late. So whereas spider mites you can see with the naked eye, it's helpful to have magnification, but you can actually see them with the naked eye. The hemp russet mite you cannot see, and so the way that you know you've got them is you've got the damage, and so at that point it's almost too late. So they, again, mostly on the underside of the leaves, although sometimes they can develop on the stems. And as a result of their feeding, the stems can become brittle, and they cause this sort of bronzing color. You'll see this middle plant here. You see the bronzing of the leaves, which is where the name hemp russet might, like russet potatoes. And then you also get this upcurling of the leaves. And so again, that slight upcurling is usually the first indication. And they can do damage on the developing buds. And again, it becomes a problem when you have severe infestations. So again, not in Vermont, but certainly concerning, and you should keep an eye out for those guys. Oops. I'm going to stop for a second and see if I can fix this. I'm having difficulty with my screen, so I'm going to try something else. Catherine, can you see that all right?
Yeah, that looks good to me.
Okay, perfect. Sorry about that. All right, so European corn borers are another pest that that we're dealing with here in Vermont on hemp. And as the name suggests, hemp is not the preferred host. So corn borers typically are going to be more problematic for corn growers. But sometimes, particularly years like last year when it was difficult for growers to get corn in the ground early on in the season, when these moths were flying looking for a place to lay their eggs, there wasn't the corn planted yet, but there was plenty of hemp. And corn borers have a wide range of alternate hosts that they can lay their eggs in. And so in certain circumstances, like what we saw last year, they can be problematic in hemp. And there's two types of problems associated with corn borer. The first is associated with the first flight. So these moths have synchronized flights. So they all emerge. In Vermont, it's temperature dependent. So in Vermont, peak flight for the first flight is late June. So they all emerge. The moths mate, they lay eggs. Again, the eggs are typically laid on a more preferred host, but in some cases hemp. And if you get an egg laid on hemp, ultimately the caterpillar then bores into the stalk. And so that first flight can lead to damage from the stalks and stems breaking as a result of their feeding behavior. Not boring like falling asleep, but boring like chewing through the stem. The second type of damage is associated with the second flight. So again, it's temperature dependent. So if there's enough degree day accumulation, and usually throughout much of New England, there's a second flight. If you get way north in a cooler year, there won't be. But if there is that second flight in August, those caterpillars that hatch out will then bore into and make a nice little house out of your buds. And so this is a picture we took at harvest last year. And you'll notice instead of a bud, you've got a caterpillar living in this nice little house with all of its frass around the outside. So the quality can be really impacted by the presence of those corn borer caterpillars in the buds. All right, so Japanese beetle, also another common pest in Vermont, but also not generally a problem on hemp. So Japanese beetles, one of the most patriotic insects out there, they emerge right around the 4th of July. Right, so before that, the grubs are feeding on roots, and at least for most agricultural crops, the grubs are not a pest, it's the adults. But with hemp, you'll notice they do a little bit of chewing on the leaves, and really, really heavy chewing is called skeletonized. They actually will eat all of the leaf except for the veins, and so it looks like the skeleton. But they are generally, again, they feed on a wide range of host plants. Hemp is not one that is heavily impacted, certainly in the northern part of New England. And the other thing is they typically are gone by the beginning of August or so, before flowers really have a chance to develop. And so we're going to come back to these guys as a case study in economics in a moment. Flea beetles are really common. There's a whole bunch of different species of flea beetles. They are these tiny, in most cases black, but sometimes striped beetles, and they jump just like fleas, which is where they get their name from. Again, the larvae feed on plant roots, and the larval feeding is really not a problem. It's the adult feeding that can cause these little shot holes in leaves. And so you see this hemp leaf over here with all those tiny little holes. But again, it's not generally a big deal, especially if your plants are well established. Seedlings are more susceptible. And then there can be another generation. Actually, there is another generation of these guys later on in the season. But again, plants are well established by August. And so that shot hole damage really doesn't seem to impact hemp. But again, don't be alarmed if you see a whole bunch of this damage you know, in June and July. In most situations, plants will grow out of that damage. Leafhoppers, there's actually a wide range of leafhoppers, but potato leafhopper is the most common pest, a leafhopper, excuse me, pest in hemp. They also, just like Japanese beetles, feed on a wide range of hosts. These are the adults, this sort of lime green wedge shape. They have wings. The nymphs, a little brighter green, they don't have wings, so they just sort of scuttle left and right. Again, mostly on the underside of the leaves. And these two, just like aphids, suck the life out of your plants. And so they stick their mouth parts in to the phloem, and as they're sucking the life out of your plants, they also will inject saliva. And the saliva actually causes the plant cells to die. And what you get is a resulting symptom called hopper burn. So on the right hand, all the way on the far right, this is the very beginnings of hopper burn. And again, once you're seeing that hopper burn, it's too late. Those hoppers have already been sucking the life out of your plant for a couple of weeks. And then this is really severe hopper burn on those leaves. Few other things I'll just quickly mention. Thrips, again, there's a wide variety of types of thrips that feed on hemp. They're really, really, really small. They have these fringed wings. In fact, the immatures don't even have wings at all. Their frass or insect feces is usually this sort of black color. And so you'll see the stem here and all these little yellow guys, those are thrips. And then that streaking is the damage, and then the black stuff is their frass. And so the feeding, again, causes that streaking. Here's a leaf with some thrips damage. But when you have really, really, really high densities as a result of multiple generations, and that happens when you have really warm temperatures, because all insects, their development is temperature dependent. And so if thrips have more time more generations in a season, those populations can build up. Right. LYGUS bug or tarnished plant bug, there's actually a bunch of different species of LYGUS bug. The most common that we deal with out here in the Northeast are tarnished plant bug. I'll just mention these guys are typically more problematic for an oilseed crop because of the damage they do to flowers. They actually can cause the flowers to abort. And so for an oilseed crop, that's particularly problematic, but it can also be problematic for resinous crops. And so they have, again, just like aphids and leafhoppers, have these needle-shaped mouth parts. They jam into the plant and suck the life out of them. They're typically around all the time in relatively low numbers. And again, for resinous crops, are not generally that big of a deal. A couple other things that particularly out in Western Canada that can be problematic, although we've never really seen them to be a problem here on the East. Cutworms, particularly for seedlings, stink bugs, grasshoppers, and armyworms. Again, we don't see them here, but just, you know, be aware that in other parts of the country, they deal with the same pests as well as others. All right, so if you kind of think about across the growing season, at least the main months of the growing season, this is when things are typically around. So at least early on in the season, you don't typically have a lot of pressure, and then also later on in the season. So we're right now in the meat of the pest management season. Potato leafhoppers blow in on wind currents, and so we're not exactly sure. Each year it changes when they show up, sometimes the very end of May, sometimes not till middle of May. And then again, corn borers may or may not have that second generation depending upon degree days. All right, so it's important to also know the good guys, right? There's a huge number of different types of insects and mites and spiders out there. Most of them are not pests, and some of them actually are helping us out. So I don't have time to go into all of the good guys, but just some of the things that you should be aware of. Lacewings are awesome predators. They have these beautiful stalked eggs. The larvae are predatory as well as the adults. Same thing with ladybugs or lady beetles, the adults and the larvae. So this is a ladybug larva here. Really great predators for things like aphids, minute pirate bugs as well, parasitoid wasps. I'm going to come back to those guys when I talk about one of the biocontrol strategies. Right, but then there are some other really cool predators out there. So spider mite destroyers, as the name suggests, are specialists on spider mites. So we like those, and they're native. You can also release them. And then hoverflies. Hoverflies look kind of like bees, but they are flies. They've got predaceous maggots that just go to town on aphids. So we like those, the good guys. And then again, there's also a whole bunch of other things out there that may or may not be doing any damage. So just because you see something doesn't necessarily mean that it's a problem. All right, so now that we've talked about some of the things that you're going to see out there, I just want to spend a little bit of time on, again, just sort of the basics of integrated pest management, and with a focus on what you can do for those pests of hemp. So again, it's really important to understand that when it comes to pest management, right, it's sort of a cynical view, but it comes down to dollars and cents, right? If there is what we call injury, now injury is the actual physical harm caused by the presence or the activity of the pest, right? That injury can result in damage, and damage is that monetary loss, right? So you should be thinking anytime you see any pests, you should be thinking, you know, how much loss is this pest actually causing, right? And then also you need to know how much it's going to cost to take some sort of action, right? And so those two things are sort of at the core of pest management. So let's take the example of the Japanese beetle that I mentioned before. So say you're out there in your hemp field this week, you're scouting, and you notice Japanese beetles chewing on your hemp leaves. So the question, again, you should be asking yourself is, am I losing money as a result of the Japanese beetle? And remember, hemp flowers haven't started to form. Your buds aren't going to be harvested until around, you know, September or so. So if they're feeding on, if the Japanese beetles are feeding on the leaves now, there may be a slight reduction in energy, but plants make plenty of extra energy. So as long as the buds are in good shape, you shouldn't be concerned, right? So I like to kind of give that example. So just because you're seeing those Japanese beetles and you're seeing the damage doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be losing money as associated with that damage, which means that you are not necessarily concerned, right? So there are a couple of terms that are often thrown around in the pest management or IPM world that are important to understand, right? And this it has to do with thresholds, right? So let's for a moment consider you've got this hypothetical pest population, and this graph here on the right-hand side shows that hypothetical population. And on the x-axis right here, you've got time, and on the y-axis, you have population density of this hypothetical pest, right? So there's those two important levels: the economic injury level. So that's when the cost to control the pest is equal to the money that you're projected to lose as a result, right? And then there's also the economic threshold, right? So the economic threshold is that population density that you're going to manage to prevent economic injury, right? And so let's think about it, right? So you got this pest population, and over time the population goes up, and then it goes down, and it goes up, and it goes down, right? If the costs associated with losing the pest are more than the costs associated with taking action, right, or your economic injury level, right, then you're going to take action. But you don't want to wait to that point when you're losing money, right? You want to take action before you're projected to lose money. And so that's where the economic threshold comes in. So the economic threshold gives you a little bit of breathing room. So if you take action when the pest population starts to grow and hits the economic threshold, right, you're not losing money yet, but you might do something and gives you a little bit of time, a little bit of breathing room before you've actually lost any money. Now remember, it's important to consider opportunity costs. So if you're going to go out and take some sort of action that involves a tractor, there's diesel, there's your time, there are unintended consequences as a result of your actions. So these are all things that you should be considering before actually doing anything, right? So that brings us to sort of the basics of integrated pest management. So IPM is really a proactive set of strategies, of complementary strategies. It's not reactive, and it's not based on eradicating the pest, but merely keeping the population low enough that you're still able to make money, right? So there's a strong emphasis on, particularly on monitoring, because again, a lot of your decisions are based on pest population levels. There are a lot of things that you can do ahead of time, like cultural controls, things that involve your actions, mechanical, controls like, cultivation is a really easy way to think about what are those physical changes that you're making to the field. Biological controls, things that you can release, and then of course, if as a last resort, you need to use a chemical, then it would be appropriate to prevent the loss of money. All right, so again, really strong emphasis on monitoring. This is actually a scouting form that Ann Hazelrig and Heather developed for scouting hemp, right? So you go into a field, ideally you're doing this weekly, you're going into a field, you want to walk in what typically is described as a W pattern, so that you're covering all different parts of the field. If you have multiple varieties, then you typically want to scout the varieties separately, because sometimes there are varietal differences. You inspect, both the top and bottom surfaces, and with insects and mites, you want to make sure that you're recording the number of individuals, what we call incidents, and then severity of damage. So if you're seeing a lot of damage, then you can use like a percent scale, that kind of thing. And what you want to do is also make sure that you keep notes. If you're seeing other things, if you're seeing beneficials, if you're seeing some weird diseases, you can always take plant samples and submit them to, and Hazelrig does diagnostic testing, but there are diagnostic labs in most, if not every state, in the Northeast. Again, cultural, mechanical controls, these are things that you are doing proactively, right? So ahead of time, so that you avoid ever having economically injurious pest levels. So making sure sanitation is good. So burial, removal of crop residues after harvest, right? So if those residues are harboring pests and they just stay in the field, then you're just leaving the pest in the field, right? So plowing in the fall, and then again tilling in the spring. What you're doing is you're stirring things up. If there are any pests that have overwintered in the soil, you're exposing them to natural enemies, the elements. A lot of weeds can harbor pests, and so good cultivation or cover cropping to keep weeds down is good for weed control, obviously, but is also indirectly good for insects. Right. In the case of certain crops that are have more preferred hosts, an adjacent trap crop can sometimes be useful. And then particularly if you think about the season long timeline I showed you, the pests, most of the pests that are impacting hemp are not around in the beginning of the season. So if you have the opportunity to get your plants established early on, they're better able to handle pests when they do show up. There's a wide variety of biological controls out on the market. Some are worth their expense, others are not. This list actually came from a conversation I had with, I can't remember his last name, but Brian at Applied Bionomics is actually a biocontrol agent manufacturer, if you will. They're out in Canada, and we kind of went back and forth. So biocontrol typically has successfully been implemented indoors in greenhouses, and not all biocontrol agents that can be purchased are appropriate for outdoor use. So the classic example is ladybugs. I love ladybugs. They're awesome predators, but they're really not worth the expense in most cases outdoors to purchase and release. Right? There's nothing preventing those ladybugs from just flying away as soon as you've released them. Right? But there are other biological control agents that are appropriate and have been successful outdoors. So trichogramma is really commonly used throughout the Northeast to control European corn borer and a whole bunch of different crops in corn, but also things like peppers, and can also be used in hemp. Right? There are Aphidoletes, excuse me, are these aphid midges. Again, really commonly used in greenhouses, but they're also can be successful to control aphids outdoors. Couple of predatory mites that have been really successful. Phallosis is actually out in the Pacific Northwest. They use it in nursery operations for like what is it, arborvitae, for instance. So that in nurseries they release the mite in an arborvitae, and it provides lifetime control for spider mites. Right. So these things overwinter. Same place spider mites overwinter, and can also be effective as the season goes on. Another predatory mite, Stratiolalips, is in the soil. It's good for a bunch of pests in the soil, but it's particularly good for chronic spider mite problems because spider mites overwinter in the soil. And so if you have a soil mite, and so think about it, in Vermont, most of the year is not the growing season. So most of the year, spider mites are susceptible to predatory mites in the soil, right? One of my favorites, as I mentioned before, spider mite destroyers are a spider mite specialist. They're actually a type of ladybug. They are naturally occurring. We have them in our hop yard, going to town on spider mites right now. You can also purchase them for release. But then there are a whole bunch of things that you can do to promote naturally occurring predators. Those ladybugs and hoverflies and lacewings that I showed you before. Things like certainly conservation spraying. So not spraying insecticides if you don't need to, right, is going to help those natural enemies. Also planting insectary plants. So plants that have flowers that are on the edges of your fields. Those flowers often provide nectar or pollen as an alternative food source for a lot of predators. That practice is called conservation biological control. It's something that can be very effective. All right, so you've done everything and you still have a problem. So then you go as a sensible last resort to chemical controls. So at least as of last night, when I was working on the polishing off this presentation, if you're in Vermont, the website down at the bottom is what the state contracts out for the pesticide registration. So these are all of the pesticides that are currently registered for use in Vermont. Again, it's pesticides, so it includes both insecticides as well as fungicides and other products, right? So you'll notice this list is not very long. And again, that has something to do with the fact that there's a lot of red tape when it comes to pesticide registration. And again, it was only legal in the it's only been legal for less than 2 years to grow cannabis, at least according to the federal government. And so this list is relatively short, right? But the state of Vermont is in my opinion, taking a reasonable approach. And so they've accepted that, okay, there aren't enough EPA registered products out there for hemp. And so we'll allow some additional things. And so this information here is right from the state website. There are a couple of criteria that a product has to meet. And as long as it meets those criteria, the state of Vermont is saying, okay, go ahead and use them in hemp, even though they're not registered. Right, so this is just the first 10 or so. If you go again to the link that's at the bottom of this page, there are like 2 pages of products that meet those criteria set by the state. And again, that is, they're not registered for use on hemp, but we're going to allow you. And again, they had those criteria laid out. So if you're outside of Vermont, it's important to check with your state. I am not as familiar with other state regulations as it pertains to pesticide usage, so I don't want to put something out there that is incorrect. Right, there's the National Pesticide Information Retrieval System managed by Purdue that has information about most states, but not all states. And so again, check with the appropriate agency in your state, and then also some of these national systems. But it's really, really important. The label is the law, right? So if you're not following the label, you are technically not following the law, right? So I just want to say one final thing. You know, let the buyer beware, right? So there's a lot of information available on the internet, and some of it's really high quality. Some of it is from reputable companies like this I pulled last night from Marone Bioinnovations. Others from less reputable sources. But really, really important to recognize that just because it's on a pesticide company's website doesn't necessarily mean that you can use it. So Grandivo and Venerate both are EPA registered for use on hemp in the US, but not currently registered by the state of Vermont. So again, just because Marone has put together this handy cannabis pest guide doesn't necessarily mean that it's okay for you to use those. Also, Jet Ag, a biofungicide produced by Marone, also EPA registered. It's actually registered for use in Vermont, but if you go on the Vermont website, it's not currently registered to be used on any site crop against any insect, against any pest, I should say. So again, make sure that you do your homework before using any products in whatever state that you're working in. All right, so really quickly, just remember there are both good things and bad things out there, and it's important to know which one you're working with. And again, there are also things out there that are neither good nor bad. So make sure that you know your fields well. And the way you do that is with an IPM approach. It's a systems approach, right? There's a strong emphasis on monitoring pest populations and beneficial populations on a regular basis. Strong cultural, mechanical, biological controls all are proactive. And then only when necessary, a sensible chemical control as a last resort. Right. The most important thing is that you have a deep understanding of the entire agricultural systems that your cannabis is grown in. And again, the most successful practitioners of IPM rely on those proactive tactics. And with that, I will, let's see, we've got about 15 minutes to take questions that you all have. There's a lot of information on our website. Down at the bottom here is the site specific to industrial hemp. We also work on a variety of other crops, that is, so there's information about all of those. If you have questions, you can always email Heather or me, and we will do our best to answer those questions. especially for folks that might be watching this on a recorded version and don't have a chance to ask questions live. So Catherine, Heather, I'm happy to take questions, although I don't know that I can see the questions.
All right, thanks, Scott. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. So I believe Catherine's just putting up some quick poll questions, so if people can answer those. And if you have questions for Scott, if you can type them in the Q&A box or the chat box is fine too. Whatever's easiest for folks. There's no questions right now, so you have it easy, Scott.
All right.
All
right, looks like we're all done here.
Yeah, right. Is neem oil effective, and is it allowed to use on hemp under Vermont law?
So neem oil can be effective. And as far as I know, there are some products that have neem in it that are allowable, but not just yeah. So I would make sure you check that list that the state has, because again, there are things, so azadirachtin is a compound that's made by neem, and there are a bunch of products that have azadirachtin that are allowable. And so I can't say that every product with neem oil or a derivative is allowable, but certainly there are some that are allowable, and it is effective on certain arthropods and mites. Sorry, insects and mites.
Sorry, I muted myself. Looks like people are asking where can we get the trichogramma wasps?
Yeah, so trichogramma, so there are some big national companies like Arabico Organics. They're out of California, if I remember correctly. But then there's also some more local suppliers. So one, IPM Laboratories out in New York is someone that is a organization that a lot of growers in Vermont work with. And so I'm not going to necessarily promote one over the other. I just know that there are a lot out there, and those are two that I can think of.
Unmute. There we go. I don't see any more quote. Here's a question. I had a small orange larva in my buds last year. Any thoughts on what it could be?
Yeah, my best guess, it's European corn borer. They do kind of look orangey red as they get bigger. And in fact, if I, let's see, can I? No, I can't go back to the picture. But yeah, that's my best guess is European corn borer. Are you guys seeing that picture there? That's a European corn borer. Again, looks kind of orangey. Are there any other questions out there? This is your last opportunity.
Yeah, I think people were wondering if we're going to share the slides. We'll definitely post the webinar online here. Usually it takes a few days to get it up, but usually we are sharing those with permission from the presenters.
You have my permission.
Thank you, Scott. All right, let's see. I don't see any more questions. And Stephanie Smith from the Agency of Agriculture posted a link to the Vermont Agency of Agriculture website that has pesticide use on hemp guidance. So that's helpful. Thank you, Stephanie. And one last question. Should I be concerned about flea beetles?
So at this point in the season, I would not be concerned about flea beetles. It's a little bit late for that first generation. Your plants are probably well established. The biggest concern in my mind for flea beetles is early in the season when you're just putting seedlings out. or if you're growing anything from seed, direct seeded outdoors, that's when they're most susceptible to flea beetle damage.
Great. So we have added a few additional webinars. Chris Callahan is going to be presenting. Catherine, do you have those dates? Our next webinar is July 30th with Ann Hazelrig talking about disease management in hemp. And it looks like August 6th is post-harvest considerations, and that will be with Chris Callahan. And then into August with hemp sampling and testing with our friends from the Vermont Agency of Agriculture, Michael D. Tomaso and Robert Shipman. So we still have some great webinars to come. And I think that was all the questions. So with that, that will conclude our, whoa. Is corn borer only found where corn is being grown?
Good question. So corn borer moths can fly over a fairly decent distance. And so just because corn is not being grown in the immediate area doesn't mean that you're not going to find corn borer. And in fact, the distribution throughout the landscape is somewhat patchy. So just because you do have corn doesn't mean you're going to have corn borer as well. But certainly there's nowhere in the Northeast that I know of that is corn borer free all of the time. Heather, I don't know if you know anything more about corn borer.
Yeah, I mean, definitely the level of corn borers can be much higher when you're in an area that has lots of corn, for sure. But it is pretty much prevalent on a broad scale basis because it has other hosts as well, obviously, right? So peppers and other crops. So it does like corn, but
it's everywhere.
Impact other crops as well. Yeah. Okay. Well, that it for today. Thank you so much, Scott, and thank
Heather.
Stitching. Hopefully, wherever you are, you're getting soap.
Yeah, it sounds like Heather's breaking up, but there's actually one more question that came in just under the wire. Is corn borer also on potato? And that's a great question. I have never heard of corn borer being a problem on potato, and I suspect that it's not just because that family of plants, they have a very kind of nasty chemistry. And so, again, I doubt it is. I've never heard of it as a problem on any of the solanaceous crops. And another question that just came in is trifecta a good preventative product? And I have to be honest, I don't know for sure if trifecta is allowed on hemp. And so I will just preface the answer based on that. But we have used trifecta in other crops, and it can be effective. And it's called trifecta because it's both effective on insects and mites and some fungi. So again, if it's allowable, and maybe on that link that Stephanie shared, you can find out for sure, it can be effective as an organic control.
Yeah, and we did trial it last year for disease control in hemp. We didn't really see any difference, but we also didn't have a lot of disease either. So we're trying to evaluate products as we can, but it takes many years to understand if they're efficacious or not. And then I see Gary Fish from Maine has said that corn borer is found on potatoes in Maine. So like we said before, lots of hosts. But we generally do see really large outbreaks in other crops when the corn crop is not very good or delayed. So it's always a concern. All right. Okay, I don't see any other questions. Now we might be off the hook.
Awesome. Well,
All
thank
right.
you.
Okay, thanks, Scott. Have a good day. Thank you, everyone.